When you're selling tickets, I take a lot of pride in that. And even when you're not selling tickets, you better be learning something.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to The Show Must Go on Sale. I am Tom Greenwald, a co founder of SpotCo, one of the leading advertising and marketing agencies that covers Broadway and live entertainment in general. Very, very delighted to have Kevin McCollum here with us today. Kevin is one of my oldest friends in this business. Kevin is one of the leading producers in this business. Let me just give you a quick rundown of some of his shows: Rent, Avenue Q, In the Heights, Drowsy Chaperone, West Side Story, Motown, Something Rotten, The Notebook, The Play That Goes Wrong, Six, the current sensation Oh Mary, and his newest show, Two Strangers Carry a Cake Across New York. Kevin has done it all in his career. That's a fraction of what he's produced. Kevin, thank you so much for being here.
Tom, it is a pleasure. 30 plus years later, you haven't aged a day, but you always had a special, unique quality.
So I'd love to start by talking about the very many kinds of shows you've produced, and if there is a different way you approach the marketing and advertising. You've done small shows, big IP shows, original shows. Many of your biggest hits have been original shows, jukebox shows. In terms of marketing, is there a different way you look at them? Have you looked back and gone, wow, the ones I thought would be hard turned out easy. The ones that I thought would be easy turned out hard. How do you attack all these different kinds of shows? Do you have a main mantra, or is it just every show is its own different challenge?
Producing is because you get excited about a story, right? And usually you get excited about a story because it affects you because somehow you are reflected in the story. There's something about your journey that is reflected in the story, even if you're not conscious of it. The problem is with marketing in the theater today is people forget the story within the marketing. And I don't only mean the story of what is exciting about your show, but the story, which is as old as time, which is why would I possibly leave my cave? So I'm always about you have to know what your philosophy of storytelling is regarding the piece of art you are presenting that has its own story, and where are the concentric circles where those two interact, and when you can ignore them, and tell just the story of trying to get people out of the cave called, your home, your town, or your sensibility when you come across a show that, oh, I know what that show is not for me. I know what that show is. My strength and my weakness, I think, is I don't like to give away a lot about the show if it's a new show, because it's not going to be effective. And I can talk more about that of you can't educate and sell at the same time. There's a period to educate and there's a period to sell. And when you have a known title, you can go right into sell mode. If you don't have a new title, you have to figure out what's going to capture the public's imagination so they're interested first in being educated about your story.
Yeah, I've said this on this podcast once or twice that I'm not a big believer in selling plot, because when you get into the weeds of plot, more often than not, you're going to turn someone off as opposed to turn them on. It's more the feeling that you have to get and you want to convey that people will get when they go to the theater. Since you've had such a round of success with sleeper hits, let's call them, starting from Avenue Q all the way up to Oh Mary, and Two Strangers is showing nice strength too. Do you take particular joy or pride in marketing a sleeper hit more than you would a Motown or a Rent?
When you're selling tickets, I take a lot of pride in that. And even when you're not selling tickets, you better be learning something. I do have a prejudice about Broadway itself, which is the sleeper hits are not really sleepers because they are usually completely original pieces of IP. So they're unknown, but I wouldn't call them sleepers. I would call them unknown. And that is a tremendous advantage to marketing in today's world, in the modern world. because, and especially, my first hit was really pre AOL, right when AOL was happening, which was the rise of real direct communication, social media. And Tommy, you were there. You remember what we did with Rent? We did a live stream from the opening night party of Rent at Chelsea Pier in 1996. And I think, Anthony Rapp was very, very astute on this new technology. And so, we had a bunch of computers at the opening night party where the actors, the original cast, would be online talking about being at the party. So, that seems so, analog now. But at the time, it was a tremendous shift of how we communicated. And when that shift happened, one of the things that we kind of knew instinctually with Rent, even from the first two rows being $20 rather than putting them in the back, is that we were those kids kind of getting into our 30s who in our 20s were like, what is this thing called Broadway? It's not for us. And Rent allowed us to really use word of mouth in a peer group. And if the young people are excited about it, the older people will say, "What is this?" And we really played into the strength. We didn't even remember Rent. We didn't even call it a musical. We didn't call it an opera. We didn't call it we just called it Rent because we understood as marketers and producers, it's this event in the theater. And so why put it in a category? So those are just things that happened that just developed my sense of you can't sell anything unless there's a conversation and a story behind the selling.
29 years later, you could say that same sentence and replace it with "Oh Mary," which is kind of an interesting bookend in terms of getting young people interested in theater again. People have been concerned about that. People are rightly concerned about that because we haven't had that hit that's touched the zeitgeist for a number of years until "Oh Mary" came along. Were you like, holy moly, this is Rent all over again 29 years later?
No, not at all. And not that they aren't both phenomenal journeys. Just some history on Rent. When I was producing Rent, and I would go to more of the older establishment, which is sort of the age I am now, they kind of didn't get it. And I saw it off Broadway. Jeffrey and I saw it together, and he'd seen it a year before in a reading. And then, there's been a lot written on this. And then I saw it with him in '94. And I turned to him after, "Will you light my candle?" And I said, "That's the best piece of music theater writing I've seen in a long time." After Act One, I said, "I want to do this." And I pulled out my checkbook, and Jonathan Larson said, "Do you want to see the second act?" And I'm like, "Is it as good as the first?" He goes, "I think it might be better." And again, the first act was not perfect by any, but there was just so much energy, and it was about the music. And because I was also a writer when I was a performer and before I transitioned to producing, I was just aware that this was very special and a vocabulary. And in the second act, I heard the first dun 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 dun, the first strains of Seasons of Love. And I was like, I was just like, this is it. And I really started to shake. Now, with O'Mary, I have to give a lot of credit to Lucas McMahon, who's been working with me for over 13 years. About 8 years ago, Lucas had been working with me for about six, and right out of college. And I said, "Look, your job is to convince me I don't know what's happening." No one knew who Jonathan Larson was, except for a few people who were really excited about his work, including a lot of artistic directors, because he did, J.P. Morgan Saves the Nation. He did a bunch. He wrote a lot of stuff, and everyone knew he was great. But it's like, what's the story? What's the story? And even when we saw it in '94, Rent hadn't fully formed yet, but we knew there was enough there to do it. So Oh Mary was also different because there's a big, huge group, given the fact the internet was in play when Rent, there was no interplay. If Jonathan Larson were writing today, he would have gotten to market a lot faster. And what happened was, I think Cole had a huge following. They were someone who had created a lot, especially during COVID. And I saw, Cole's, Bernadette Peters does her taxes.
Sally's a Broadway show.
Okay, you're in a Broadway show.
Yeah, I've done a couple of them.
I'm not a lot on social media personally. I'm not a YouTuber. I'm not a TikToker. My company has an Instagram, but I do not live on social media. It's just not where I live. And Cole had created a great following. So we had Lucas was astute enough to know that Cole needs to really have a show, and their agents were like, "We have a play, and we might have a partner for you, and Mike and Carly, who do a lot of off Broadway." And it was just a really wonderful combination of, Lucas had a mission to work with people that he knew, and I had known of Cole, but I did not have full disclosure. And there's no listen. My goal is to make sure people keep producing for the theater long after I'm doing it and long after I'm here. And so I was very heartened that and excited to support the show at the Lortel, even though for a play it was still 1.2 million, and there weren't a lot of people throwing money at us. We were just like, we're going to do this. With Rent, truly, the cost of Rent was $150,000 for a musical at New York Theater Workshop. The threshold of cost was 1.2 million for a play at the Lucille Lortel.
A small play.
Yeah, but we did it commercially. We produced it commercially as opposed to work with a not-for-profit. So we had a little more freedom to just do it and rent the theater. And when we went on sale, we had a very good day, over 70,000 off Broadway. And I was like, okay, the internet knows. And that's when I knew I had actually more information about the show with that $70,000 wrap than I did the first time we put Rent on sale with New York Theater Workshop, which trickled in a few seats. They were very different experiences, Tom, even though they both captured the imagination, and the zeitgeist of Oh Mary comes from the fact of it's about the presidency. It's about a piece of American history, but it's really a comic romp and silly uh, and genius at the same time. And we hadn't had sort of that original kind of laughter, pure belly laughs in a long time. And, theater is always reflective of what we're thirsty for in our culture. And I think we are thirsty to laugh and live in the absurdity to figure out how we get back to center. And I think Rent did that in the storytelling of as New York got more and more expensive and artists were being pushed out, and we were dealing in the rearview mirror of, basically 15 years before the decimation of the AIDS virus, and trying to find family and build family. And they're both about, aspiration of finding your voice. Oh Mary is really about finding your voice for Mary Todd Lincoln as a character. And we all can relate to that not being heard or not being seen or not being provided the opportunity. And that's what the theater often is selling. My shows are diverse, but my shows also have a central point. And you mentioned it earlier. I always said the biggest antagonist of a musical is plot, and the protagonist are understanding what the stakes are. And the stake I trade in primarily, and it's because I have an orphan mentality, which we can talk about, is that I am always attracted to stories where your protagonist is think they want one thing, but actually what they're really searching for is how to find their family against all odds. So when I look at structure, and we actually talked about structure on Motown because you were very influential at Motown. I did a reading, and you said, "I don't know why you're not starting this way, and if it's really going to end here." And I think you remember it, and I'm like, "That's right. That's a really good way." And Barry Gordy, who wrote it, and also had additional material by Dick Scanlon and David Goldsmith, was that he was alive and he still is, and he's great, and it's amazing to work with him and have worked with him. But he also wanted to make sure he told the story without hurting too many people or anybody, because there's always conflict in life. But the stakes were you built an infrastructure that allowed these Black artists who were not being allowed in the room to be in the room, and you built your family. But eventually the family has to grow up, because it's a story about letting your kids go. which is still about how does love conquer all. And so we talked a lot, if you remember, about how we were starting, which sort of started very small, like some other musicals about lives have started this way. And you came to me because I don't understand why you're not just starting with a big beginning. I'm like, you're absolutely right. We should start with the Battle of the Stars and then really make it a much stronger beginning to begin your flashback. So, Tommy, you're a writer, which is why you're a brilliant marketer, but it all is storytelling in the marketing and the story you're telling, and then how to tell the story. So I digress, but I guess what I'm trying to say is you talked about the diversity of my shows. I'm just trying to stay in the room and form a family against all odds. I speak a lot about what producing is, and I talk more in philosophy rather than a producer doesn't have tasks. A producer creates the infrastructure where the story that everyone is on the same vocabulary of what story you're telling, whether that's in the show or in your marketing campaign.
Kevin, let me ask you one more micro thing about Oh Mary, just before we talk about other stuff. When you started the conversations, you and Lucas and your producer partners with your advertising shop about when you were about to move to Broadway, did you say to yourself, "We can go right out to the mass market and appeal to the casual theater goer," or did you say, "We have to stick to the smart downtown crowd that knows who Cole is, and let them be our ambassadors and spread the word of mouth, and let as you said earlier, once the cool kids go, everybody else is like, what's that thing the cool kids are going to?" Did you stick to the cool kids early on, or did you go out wide?
The cool kids are everybody, right? If you're living in New York and you're interested in the arts, you're kind of the question is you're often disappointed because nothing surprises you. We knew we had a show that was a surprise. And I will say, I'm going to give Mike and Carly also a lot of credit. Mark and Carly are two of the most inventive producers we have working today. Their niche is, a lot of, comedy, one person, and also authors and performers in the same entity. And I've done a lot of shows, whether it was Drowsy Chaperone or In the Heights or Title of Show, and many, many more that might not have gotten to Broadway, where the author is also in the show. And so Mike and Carly had developed a brand, which, because they had worked in a lot of downtown venues, they could actually keep their lists, and the ticketing that came with the theater allowed them to create their own sort of brand with their data. So they have a very robust sort of, they talk directly to their customers in ways a lot of commercial producers can't, in the way our theater is currently structured. And so they had a very potent downtown, quote unquote, list. But living downtown is also the establishment as well as the cool kids. So if you're on the island of Manhattan or within a 50-mile radius, you're here for a reason. And it's because you're interested in the arts, a lot of people. So if we can put something that is surprising on the market and then backed up by our off-Broadway reviews, which were some of the best reviews for an off-Broadway show in a long, long time, and we were still kind of coming out of COVID and looking for something to sort of excite us about coming out of our caves, Oh Mary was that show. And we therefore didn't spend a lot. Advertising is very similar to what happened to the news, where everyone would eat dinner and there'd be three channels to choose from, and all the news said it the same way. Now there are so many opportunities, from influencers to organic social to regular social to friends.
So diffuse, it's all over the place.
And therefore, as it is getting more diffused, the most important thing is, what did your friend think of it? The person that you spend time with on the holidays, did they like it? Do you want to go together? You know what? And also New York is a very cynical place, and I'm a warrior against cynicism. So my favorite thing is, oh yeah, I know about that show you're doing, but it's this. And a lot of times it'll be like, yeah, it has only four characters, or they'll talk about something about the economics they read, but a lot of times, like, but the show makes you feel something different, or people wouldn't be talking about it. So you cannot advertise yourself into a hit
The element of surprise, Kevin, you mentioned that earlier. Have you found that it's harder to market and find the element of surprise when you've done a few shows off of big IP like Doubtfire and Notebook? I'm fascinated by this topic because people keep turning to this epic IP to make theater, especially musical theater. And it's hard to make it work because I think the element of surprise is lacking a lot of times. Whereas The Drowsy Chaperone, you didn't even have an off-Broadway run. You had an LA run, and people were like, holy shit, what is this thing? It's incredible. How do you find the element of surprise?
I'm going to make this about you again. Let me tell you about Tom Greenwald.
Oh boy.
He's a lyricist, he's a poet, he's very astute. He lets others talk. And then when he says something, it's like, oh, right. That's true. What Tom taught me is your vulnerability can be your strength. And our vulnerability on The Drowsy Chaperone, and I think I remember coming into a room and saying to you, look, we just had this LA run. I want to be in, I can't educate and sell at the same time. I was saying it back then, and we were agreeing. And I'm like, but it's a really good show, but people don't know anything about it. And it's such a unique format. And I don't want to give anything away, but I want to create anticipation. And I think theater people go to the theater to see something they've never seen before. And then you went away and came back with, I think, the greatest text ad campaign in the history of Broadway. And I know it is because there's a guy who we all know and who was mellowed in his advanced years, who was always too smart to do what he was doing, named Michael Riedel, who was trained was to put things down and be the snarkiest, most cynical. I knew it was a great campaign because after we put it out, Michael Riedel said it's the worst campaign ever. And as soon as someone is telling you it's the worst campaign, you're in the conversation and you are home free. And for the listeners, I will tell you what the campaign was. And the first ad campaign for the New York Times was this full page ad when there was such a thing that said, sometimes you can tell just by the title, the show is going to be amazing. This is not one of those times. The Drowsy Chaperone. Remember when you came into the room and we had a bunch of other stuff too,
Yeah.
and we looked at that, I was like, that is so audacious. That is the story I am telling within the story I'm telling. Because if people who don't know The Drowsy Chaperone, it's about a man who puts on the record because it's what he puts on to escape the real world, which is what I did as a kid in Hawaii growing up, raised by a single mom. So I related to Man and Cher as a human, and nobody else got it because I actually experienced that as an escape to my childhood. When you came up with that line, I was like, okay, this could be an all text campaign. We haven't had an all text campaign. And I will say, I think we were the precursor to ad campaigns like what Spamalot did. The other thing we did with The Drowsy Chaperone is we put Man and Cher, when we bought an ad in the middle of what then was the ABCs around the Tony Awards, the ad campaign was Man and Cher holding the album and says, look, mom, I'm in the ABCs. So the character was living out their Broadway fantasy within, even if you hadn't seen the show, like, what is this show? And we were up against Jersey Boys, which is very clear to understand what Jersey Boys is. But we were that surprise. We were that Rice Krispie treat in the middle of the pie contest.
To my mind, the granddaddy of all your audacious moves was the Something Rotten campaign, which was audacious from start to finish. I think the most audacious moment was when we had 12 Tony noms, maybe 13. And,
Yeah, we had 10 Tony noms.
You getting the ad?
Yeah, we had 10 Tony noms. Of course, I'm getting the ad. For
Yeah.
those of you on the radio, yeah.
Still one of the best ads I've ever been a part of.
So again, the headline was we lost the Tony to Fun Home. It was at the Tony party. Drew and you and I, we were sort of huddling. And then we started talking about all the great shows like, West Side Story lost to Music Man and Wicked lost to Avenue Q, and which story I was also a part of. But the idea that great shows sometimes lose. We should lead with our vulnerability, which is everyone's going to say, oh, they lost. And like, let's celebrate it. And we all agreed. And in 24 hours, the headline, if you haven't seen it, is Loser, best musical. So Loser, but we still were able, because everyone says winner. in their ads. We said loser best musical, 2025 Tony Award. And then we wrote We're in Great Company. And we these are all the musicals we wrote. West Side Story, Gypsy, Oliver, Funny Girl, Hair, Follies, Grease, Pippin, Chicago, Dreamgirls, Sunday in the Park with George, Into the Woods, Miss Saigon, Mamma Mia, Wicked, The Drowsy Chaperone, Next to Normal, Matilda, Beautiful, the Carole King musical, Aladdin.
None of them won Best Musical. That is incredible. Still incredible. Something Rotten is one of the highlights just in terms of originality and comic genius as a show. And Kevin, you've done this all your career with your shows. When you do comedies, the marketing has to be funny if you want people to believe the show will be funny. And I think Something Rotten, everything we tried to do was funny. You've got some shows now that have been, you've got Six that's been running forever. You've had huge long runners in the past. Do you look at the marketing of a long-running show and keeping it fresh as its own separate challenge? And how do you approach that?
But the goal is what I've noticed, and and I've been fortunate. I've had a lot of shows that have captured the public's imagination, and that's the term I use in terms of like let's not talk about like is this going to work in the moment? Is it going to capture the public's imagination? Is it going to create conversation? Because marketing today, and again, and especially for young people, they know when they're being sold because their whole lives, especially my kids are now 25 and 26 and they grew up with this machine. I didn't, but they know when they're being sold. So how you provide them information about the show but still make it their choice is really, really important. You obviously got to get through your first year. You got to get through those. You got to be able to run through the first season and hopefully get on the Tony Awards so people start writing and talking about you. But then if you're good enough to run 2 or 3 years, like, can I run to seven? Seven is really important because seven is a generational shift because you were, let's say, 12 when it opened, and let's say it's Avenue Q. But once we got to 7 years, and we did it by going to off Broadway. So together we ended up running like 13, just as long as Rent, but 9 of those were off Broadway, 5 of those were on Broadway. And it's and now we're reviving it in London. We've announced we open in April 16th in London. We're doing a 20th anniversary because it's 20 years since it opened in London. If it catches on, we're going to make a couple of adjustments, and if it catches on, hopefully we'll bring it back to New York and have a revival. But in New York as well. But it's that how do you run to seven? And so, Six has been running for 5. I think we'll definitely run at least till 6 years and hopefully get to 7. And then there's a whole new rebirth that happens. Capture is now our friend. We always were afraid to film things and make it available. But maybe in year 5 or 6, you're hoping there's a movie or something Netflix does something or HBO Max, or you just do it yourself and do it in movie theaters. Six in London filmed the original Company at Hampstead Court, which was the home of Henry VIII. I wouldn't let it come here, but they did it in London. It was the highest grossing, in cinemas, sort of theatrical they'd ever had. Probably in the next year or two, I'm going to let it come here in the summer when we're not on the road. We tour every year, primarily from September to May, and we usually don't we let the summer because the touring markets aren't as strong in the summer, and that way we get more clearance in the next year because we haven't used up all the cities, and we can keep rejuvenating the tour because you can go back to markets every 2.5 to 3 years.
Well, wait a second, Kev. What's your theory on movies of shows helping or hurting? I mean, the conventional wisdom has kind of changed over the years, right?
Yeah, well, Rent, we had a holdback for Rent. It finally went out in, I think, in our 10th or 11th year on Broadway. And that movie, I think, helped us run another 2 or 3 years, regardless of what you thought of the movie. You had a movie company putting, at that time, $35 million of advertising, just to understand for people at home. If you spend 100,000 a week at that time, which was a lot, let's say it's 75,000 when we were doing Rent, right? So the most you're spending in a year is, 4 to 5 million in advertising. And then in a 2-month period, you get $35 million of advertising of something called Rent. Even if people had seen the show or they liked the movie or didn't like the movie, especially if you didn't like the movie, you said, I want to go see it live again and remember what it was live. And we had a huge uptick in, I mean, I think Chicago helped Chicago because it's different. It's different on stage. So I think that helps. I think it helps. You just don't want to do it if it's getting momentum. You want to get to a point where you need that extra advertising. I mean, I have The Devil Wears Prada in London, starring Vanessa Williams, and we're looking, to when we're going to bring it here, and we're going to do some other productions in Europe before that, and there's a movie. And just what it's done in London, just people talking about it, filming Devil Wears Prada 2 has been very, very powerful to us of reminding people, oh, there's a musical and there's only one place to see it. And it's in at the Dominion Theater, which is the largest West End theater with 2,000 seats. And we've done, we're into our second year and going strong. And Vanessa Williams is wonderful, and our cast, our original company, as well as our new company. Just people are loving the show because it's a great night out.
Kevin, you mentioned the generational shift. Like for Six, how long has it been running now? 5 years?
5 years on Broadway, and it's been running around the world about eight.
Well, if you stand in the back of the house now and you see a 12 to 14-year-old girl loving the show, is it the same as the 12 to 14-year-old girl who loved it 5 years ago? Is there anything different about that kid?
Usually, it's also the cousin who is like 16, who wants to bring either the younger sister or the younger cousin, or she's now old enough to chaperone. So when she was 12, said, I got to take you, you're now 12, you're 13. It becomes a theatrical bat mitzvah in many ways
Yeah.
because, and what makes the show work is it's multi-generational. I had the same thing at Motown. I mean, one of the greatest things at Motown, the story of seeing the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter uh, coming together to see Motown. And you get that same thing in Six as well. And there's a lot of also dads and boys because the thing about Six is every successful musical, Rent had it, Avenue Q has it, Two Strangers had it, is that it's not about the plot. It's about the stakes and the code of the stakes. So finding your family against all odds. So what is Six really about? It's six female identifying characters, right? Who are having a contest of who had it worse, only to realize that, you know what? If we keep comparing ourselves, we're diminishing who we really are. Now, we have to work together. Now, I saw Six and I didn't know anything about the tutors, but I was raised by a single mom. And what I saw was I was living in a country in 2018 when I first saw it, and when it was just starting out in London. And that's when I didn't produce from scratch. So I give great credit to Andy Barnes, Kenny Wax, and George Stiles, who actually then came to me and said, would you help us get it to North America? And I joined them as a producer. And we made some changes, and they were we worked together on the campaign here, which was different. And I said, why it's going to be bigger here than you realize, because they thought it might should be going off Broadway. And I said, it's a Broadway show. If you're not going to let me do it on Broadway, don't let me have it. Because I cannot, this is not an off Broadway show. It's a Broadway show.
So when they originally came to you, Kev, they thought it was an off-Broadway situation?
Because, right. In fact, I was the only one who went to them and said, this is a Broadway show. And they kind of laughed at me. They said, no, I said, it's a Broadway show. And the reason it's a Broadway show is the stakes are really about women's rights. And there was no way to talk about the rising sense of misogyny in our country coming from Trump one. And we weren't able to. And the great thing about art is that it reflects what people are thirsty for and tries live entertainment. You come in as strangers and you leave as a family through a collective watching in real time. There is something that happens to the neurological pathways that is much more powerful than watching a projected image. And you feel safer and you hold the material longer in your brain and your body and your sense of self. And Six is really about women's voices and working with feminine energy of collaboration as opposed to the male energy of competition, is how we're going to survive as a species. That is truly, that's not hyperbole. That is the code that makes Six sing.
You're absolutely right. I feel like when I saw Six in Chicago, uh, I honestly went in thinking this is a jukebox musical with a bunch of songs from the 80s and 90s. I didn't understand what I was seeing. And then two songs in, I was like, wait a second, maybe even one song in. The first song's so great. I'm like, this sounds like a classic, but I don't think I've ever heard this song before. And it's that element of surprise that you were talking about before that I know a lot of people see when they, by the time they see this show, they know the music cold. That has happened with certain shows, and I think that happened early on with this show because it swept the internet, the score. But there are a lot of people who saw the show who had no idea what they were getting in for and just were blown away by the originality of it all. And I feel that the same thing with The Play That Goes Wrong, the same thing with Oh Mary, the same thing with Rent, Q, Heights, Drowsy. It's like you've managed to capture that, you and your collaborators, that lightning in a bottle over and over again.
Thank you. There's no formula, but I will tell you there's a pattern. The shows you just mentioned, and the thing I'm kind of most heartened by in the short time I'm on this planet, because again, I lost my mom when I was 14. She was 40, and I was raised by her. My dad wasn't in the pictures since I was one, and so I didn't know him. And he died the same year my mom died, actually, different reasons. But I realized at a young age I'm only here for so long. So how do I contribute in the short time I'm here? And I am most heartened that every one of those shows you just mentioned were first-time writers and first-time directors to Broadway. Obviously, I'm just a collaborator, but I have had success with first-time people because actually it's a real collaboration. There's not about lawyers. It's not about all the wonderful agents that are my friends that, I work with all the time. They are like, how do I make this better? And I am asking, can you do this? Could you give me this? I think the audience is telling us this. And my strength is I'm a pretty good audience member. And people ask what a Sherpa, what a producer is. And I said, a producer is a Sherpa. And my job is to make sure you don't die on the mountain because you don't understand the weather. And the weather is your audience. So I am telling you, the audience is not interested. It is snowing on you right now. They are cold and they want to be somewhere else. You have to fix it. So first time authors and directors actually will listen to the Sherpa.
It's so impactful that you talk about your first time, your relationship with first time authors, which I've heard you mention before. Are you concerned that too many of these authors don't stick with the theater game? Like, is our art form in trouble? Because, I mean, people have talked about this for decades, how people follow the riches of Hollywood and film and television. But you've had so much experience with young writers finding success. How have you felt about what's happened to a lot of these writers as they've gone on in their careers? Do you wish that there was a way the theater could hold on to them more tightly?
The great news about the theater for a writer, anyone who's worked in Hollywood would love to be in the theater and have a hit in theater because you get to own your copyright. Remember, as a producer in the theater, I don't own the copyright. I have an exclusive license to produce, which allows me to spend more money to try to make money for everybody. In Hollywood, they give you large upfront fees. I think we need to make our fees more upfront in the theater, and I think we need to have more partnerships between producers and writers. I think it's a hybrid of what we have currently, which is all or nothing. I think there's much more money we need to give to writers upfront so they can stay in the theater, they can put a down payment on an apartment and then make a life here. But we're such a back end deal. And the back end is so elusive, you can lose 7 years waiting for a back end that doesn't come.
Yeah.
I don't understand why authors don't work with experienced producers or just powerful producers or new producers who are enthusiastic and make different kinds of deals. We have a one size fits all economic model between the producer and the author for Broadway that is Byzantine from a 1980s lawsuit. And I have worked tirelessly ever since I got in this industry to bring both sides together. And we're getting there. I think we're finally getting there. But I think, the theater used to be an industry where everybody shared in the risk. And in the late 80s and the early 90s, it shifted to the real estate didn't have the risk, and we need them, and they're collaborators, and they're wonderful. But the risk reward ratios are out of alignment. And as a storyteller, there is a better story to tell economically to create more more retention in the theater so that people don't have to run to Hollywood to make a fat check quickly.
You're on the case, you promise?
I've been working on it for 30 years. I mean, I am that Sherpa. I am still climbing the mountain.
Yeah. You're one of the few that has also managed to make hit after hit without having to rely on the star system. And for that, I thank you, and the industry thanks you. Stars are great, and God knows we need them,
They're
but
great replacements.
they're great.
They're great replacements. Since they're not giving me their entire year,
Yeah,
come in for 6 months. And
yeah,
actually, we're doing that wonderfully. And I'm very grateful for everyone coming in and working with us on also Oh Mary, which
yeah,
is fantastic.
yeah.
So we
Fantastic.
can have a difference of also stars that are nichey,
Yeah,
everyone might not know certain people we put in Oh Mary, but if we can raise their profile, then we're doing a great job as
yeah.
producers as well.
Kev, before I let you go, I have two last questions. One is, we talked about a bunch of them, but do you have a favorite campaign of the many indelible campaigns you've worked on over the years? That's part A. And part B is a campaign that you have loved that was not yours, that you looked at and said, man, that's a great campaign. I will say that to that second half of the question, I've asked a few people so far. I've gotten a lot of "Oh Marys" back on that one. So mazel tov to you, mazel tov to you guys on that one.
They are right. I got to give a lot of credit to Lucas, Mike, and Carly as
Yeah,
well.
yeah,
You know,
yeah, for sure,
I,
for
I
sure.
was I was there, but I have to tell you, they really. What I love is also to see a younger generation have a similar ethic that I care
Yeah,
so much about.
yeah,
Was very exciting to be a part of.
yeah. Nice. So of yours, can can
Yes.
you can you single out
Yeah.
a
I think.
favorite
I
baby?
think. Well, I'm gonna talk about an overall campaign, and then I'm gonna talk about a specific campaign within a campaign. The one we got right from the very beginning that I think is the best campaign, and you're a co-author of it, is Drowsy Chaperone, because it was so unlike people thought I was crazy, including Jeffrey Seller, my business partner at the time. So much so that he said, "You go do that one yourself."
Now that's Broadway.
I just think that was a great campaign. I think everything we did in that first year was great. The best campaign within a campaign is when we realized, and I brought it. You were at Spot, and I said, we realized. I said, we just had this. We just had the fall preview for 2002, and Avenue Q wasn't mentioned, and it's because we opened in August, which nobody at the time, Hairspray hadn't done that yet. So nobody had opened in August, but we had to open in August because that was the only date that Jerry Schoenfeld gave me the theater, which was a playhouse that many of the Schuberts thought, why are you doing a musical in a playhouse? And I said, it's perfect. And so therefore we realized people forgot we're in this season. And Vinny, and rest in peace, and you, and Drew, and Jeffrey, and I,
And
and we
Jim
created this,
Edwards, Jim
and Jim
Edwards.
Edwards,
Yeah.
and we said we have to like remind people we're in the season, and we created the campaign where we bought ads for other shows to announce their opening because we were welcoming them to our season. We needed to claim ownership because the people writing about the theater were too lazy to understand we were part of that season. And I was so furious.
I
And my
remember that well.
rage,
And
my rage helped, I think,
yeah,
create the urgency that we have to own the season and be the mayor.
yeah,
And so we created a campaign where we created funny titles like Taboo was Fabu,
yeah.
and we had and Never Gonna Dance was Never Gonna Have Legs because we had puppets, and we those campaigns were great, which culminated in the authors writing a song during the Tony time. Like, there's a lot of great choices, but the key is vote your heart, because we knew people loved our show, but everyone was saying Wicked was going to win, and Wicked's a great show. And the authors came up with the idea of let's just write a song in the spirit of children's television to educate people that you do have choice, you know.
Vote your heart. Deep down, you know you care. Sure.
So that was the campaign within the campaign, but the campaign from beginning to end that really put the show on the map, that I don't think we'd have the success, where I think Avenue Q would have had the success even though if we didn't do that campaign. But Drowsy Chaperone was unique. The one I wasn't involved with that I have a lot of admiration for, and it goes back to word of mouth. It's what Mormon did with Twitter, owning the Twitter sphere,
Interesting.
which basically said, you might think the show is too dirty or you can't see it, but everybody is talking positively about it. So even though it's really, really on the edge of appropriate, it's a great night in the theater. And I think that was really, really smart.
Well, do you remember when in the life of that show that Twitter thing took hold?
Really early, pretty early.
It was early, right? And it was kind of
Pretty
early
early,
days
and-
of Twitter
and-
too, right?
It was the early days of Twitter, and they threw a lot of money at it. And so it was everywhere. You couldn't ignore it. Now, I don't produce that way, but they were dealing, Trey and Matt had they had a television show behind them, and I never had that kind of thing. They were everywhere. They spent a lot of profits advertising when they were already sold out, and sometimes people think that's I don't produce that way. A
Yeah.
lot of people do. A movie sensibility produces that way because you're always spending a lot before your big weekend, and then your brand has value. But the difference is in the theater, we don't own the copyright. We don't own the copyright, so it doesn't work out economically as well as it does when you're a movie.
Yeah. And you want to last for years in the theater, and you want to last
Exactly.
for weeks in the movies.
The movies, everything's about capitalization. In the theater, everything's about running costs.
Ladies and gentlemen, the wisdom, the wit, the wonderful, wizened wisdom of Kevin McCollum. Not a lot of rage, Kev. I still hear a lot of joy in your voice. I hear a lot of joy in your
thank
voice
you.
for this
I
business.
do. I get a lot. I say I'm filled with rage just so people leave me alone.
Kevin's track record is one that should give him joy because he has figured out the magic formula for making shows that, as he said, have captured the imagination of this public again and again and again. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tommy.